Chapter 4. Changes in Life. Today is July 22, 1975. It's an extremely important moment for Nam and his family because it truly marks the beginning of a new life in formal American society, rather than wandering from one refugee camp to another, full of anxiety and uncertainty as before. The airplane began its final approach to land at SeaTac Airport in Seattle, Washington State. Nam's wife was busy adjusting the children's clothing, making sure everything was in order, and she didn't forget to straighten her husband's tie. The sunlight outside was beautiful, casting moving shadows through the windows. Everyone waited quietly, in anticipation. The plane came to a complete stop at the passenger gate, and a gentle voice from the flight attendant over the loudspeaker said, "Welcome to Washington State." Nam's family followed the people ahead of them, and stepped out of the plane. "Hello. Are you Mr. Nguyen?" Nam quickly halted, right in front of a man about 40 years old, with a kind and open smile, standing with a woman who was probably his wife. "Yes, I am." A firm, warm handshake filled with affection made Nam feel comfortable, like meeting an old friend. The man introduced himself as Richard Hanner, and the woman as Mrs. Darlene Hanner, whom Nam had spoken with several times over the phone while working as an interpreter at Camp Pendleton. They were members of a church, here to welcome Nam's family. After a brief exchange, they guided the family to the waiting area to retrieve their luggage. Here, Nam also met several other church members who had come to greet them, such as Reverend and Mrs. Basler, Reverend and Mrs. Joe Grandi, and Mr. and Mrs. Gorman Calling. Nam noticed that everyone was cheerful and eager, as if they were welcoming a close relative. Nam wasn't sure if this was the first time the church had sponsored a refugee family, because everyone seemed so enthusiastic and dedicated to helping. After collecting their luggage, which was nothing more than 2 bags of old clothes obtained from the camp, packed in 2 cardboard boxes, Nam's family split into 2 groups to head to their temporary residence. The convoy left SeaTac International Airport, driving through seemingly endless highways. About 20 minutes later, they stopped at a roadside restaurant where everyone got out to have coffee and lunch. Nam's children loved the hamburgers and Coca-Cola, and they seemed very comfortable. The sun was now directly overhead, and Nam's wife, feeling warm, took off her thick coat. Nam also fumbled with his tie, which had become an uncomfortable nuisance around his neck. This was Nam's first time setting foot in the far north of the United States, and he had assumed that the weather here was always cold year-round, with snow never melting on the mountain peaks. Nam had learned this lesson back in 1965, after completing his helicopter pilot training on the CH-34, while en route back to Vietnam. The Boeing 707 had landed at Anchorage Airport, Alaska, to refuel and pick up more passengers before crossing the Pacific Ocean to Vietnam. Sitting comfortably inside the warm airplane, he looked outside at the bright blue sky and thought that it must be warm outside, so he lazily left his coat behind, not wanting the extra hassle. But as soon as he stepped out onto the stairway to descend, his ears felt numb from the cold. There was no wind, but the cold was as biting as ice. Nam and his friends had to quickly run into the waiting room to escape the bitter cold of the far north. Since then, like a bird hit by an arrow, Nam had feared any tree branch that looked like a bow, and that's why his family was dressed more heavily than necessary and not in season. After finishing lunch, the convoy continued on its way. Nam quietly watched the scenery around him. Everything here was so different. The trees were abundant and lush, unlike in California, where the sun scorched nearly year-round, and the fields were a uniform yellow, stretching to the horizon with only a few sparse clusters of trees standing like the last remaining teeth in the gums of old people. It seemed the car was passing through a farm, and Nam noticed some cornfields to the right of the road. The corn was growing tall, almost ready to bear fruit. This reminded Nam of the story of the colonel tending a garden that had been rumored in Camp Pendleton. He reassured himself it probably won't be like that, because the church sponsorship involved many people helping, so it wouldn't be as bad as he had imagined. Moreover, before accepting sponsorship in Bellevue, Nam had asked for advice from Mrs. Beryl E. Cox, who assured him that this area was the most beautiful and affluent in the state, so he felt somewhat reassured. About 10 minutes later, the car entered a residential area with well-maintained and beautiful streets. Mr. Hanner, who was driving, turned to Nam and said, "We're almost at your temporary residence." Nam nodded gratefully. Finally, the car stopped in front of a charming white house with a smooth green lawn and various flowers blooming in the garden leading to the front door. Nam's wife and children had already gotten out of the car and followed Mr. and Mrs. Calling inside, while Nam lugged the luggage behind them. The family was assigned to the basement level of the Callings' house. Nam and his wife slept in one room, while the children slept in the family room outside, which was relatively well furnished. Mrs. Luala Calling mentioned that Nam's family would stay there for about a week until their apartment was ready for them to move in. This was also the first time Nam had lived with an American family, so he carefully instructed his wife and children to observe the customs and habits of the host family to avoid any mistakes. On the second day, the church members took turns helping Nam's family with the necessary paperwork, such as applying for Social Security benefits. There, after answering a few questions, they wrote Nam a check for $500 and issued some food stamps. For a moment, Nam was stunned, not understanding why they would give him such a large sum of money. He handed the check to the church representative, who explained that it was his money and that the government would send the same amount every month until he found a job. In truth, Nam had no idea that the social services would provide such assistance because he had always thought that he would have to find a way to support his family on his own. After leaving the Social Security office, Nam's wife wanted to visit the Chinese market to buy some Asian food. At that time, there were no Vietnamese grocery stores, only a Chinese market called Wasan, where many Asians shopped, and occasionally one might be lucky enough to meet a fellow Vietnamese. Nam and his wife were so naive that they thought food stamps couldn't be saved for long, so they spent all of them at once on rice, Thai fish sauce, and various snacks. They couldn't finish eating it all, so they ended up giving some of it to the church members. While staying with the Callings, Mrs. Calling taught Nam's wife how to use common household appliances, such as the dryer, washing machine, and dishwasher, while Nam's wife showed her how to cook Vietnamese dishes and mix fish sauce. Initially, their children couldn't stand the smell of fish sauce and would cover their noses and ears, sticking out their tongues, but once the sauce was mixed with lime and garlic, the whole family sat down to eat and praised the delicious flavor. To this day, the Calling family still uses fish sauce instead of salt and pepper as they used to. A few days later, the church contacted a Vietnamese family living nearby with their sponsor, so one evening after dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Calling took Nam to visit them and introduce him to the first Vietnamese person he met on this foreign land, Mr. Vu Duc V. After a brief conversation, Mr. V revealed that he was also a former Air Force officer who had been transferred to work for Prime Minister Nguyen Sao Ky. He was a writer in the Air Force, so he intended to return to school to study journalism at Bellevue Community College. Not long after, he launched the first Vietnamese newspaper in Washington state called Dat Moi, New Land, providing a valuable source of mental nourishment for the Vietnamese community in Seattle and surrounding areas, thanks to his extraordinary efforts. In the following days, church members taught Nam's wife how to recognize different denominations of money and coins, as well as how to shop and understand the necessary items in supermarkets. It wasn't as simple as shopping in the markets back home, where meat, fish, and vegetables were all pre-packaged in plastic bags, with English labels that were hard to understand. Nam's wife had the habit of buying food based on visual and tactile cues, so she sometimes confused one thing with another, especially since essential items couldn't be easily described with hand gestures. Since arriving, she had only been able to engage in everyday social exchanges, mostly smiling politely and going mute or speaking English with hand gestures. Nam had a young adopted niece who quickly learned English, and she told him that English was easy, giving examples like saying "Ek Zao Lan," stir-fried frog excellent, to praise someone, or "Zdap," bicycle shut up, to tell someone to be quiet, implying that English was just like Vietnamese and not difficult at all. Due to the language barrier, Nam's wife once bought pork to cook in coconut milk as a New Year dish with pickled vegetables, but she mistakenly bought lamb instead. After marinating and carefully cooking it, When she served it at the table and Nam took a bite, he was startled by the strong gamey smell of lamb. Unaccustomed to the taste, he had to set down his chopsticks, but his wife thought he was being picky, so she tried it herself. After barely chewing it, she quickly spat it out, agreeing with Nam. In the end, their eldest son, curious about the new taste, devoured it all within a day or two. The loosely translated Vietnamese saying, "better to be stabbed than to be mimicked," certainly applied, as Nam found himself embarrassed at least a few times due to his poor pronunciation when speaking English. The story Nam is about to tell isn't much different from the story of the minister. It goes like this. During the Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam, King Khai Dinh summoned a high-ranking official responsible for bridges and roads to ask about the construction of a bridge being built by the French governor, General Paul Doumer. After reporting on the progress of the project, the king asked for the name of the person who initiated the bridge project. The official turned red and hesitated, asking the king for permission to speak, explaining that the name was not appropriate. After the king insisted, he reluctantly stammered out, "Your Majesty, his name is Doumer," leaving the court stunned by the strange and vulgar-sounding name. Editor's note: Doumer, as pronounced in Vietnamese, is loosely equivalent to mother efker. Hence the awkwardness and slight humor of various words. Nam's story wasn't quite as bad because, after all, he had already been to this country twice, though it was more for training than anything else. In reality, Nam had only attended English classes at Lackland Air Force Base, San Antonio, Texas, for about 6 months, while the other years were spent studying aircraft mechanics, weather, and flying techniques on various aircraft types for the South Vietnamese Air Force. One day, when Nam's wife was hosting a meal for church guests and everyone had arrived, Nam invited them to sit at the table. Instead of saying, "Please sit down," Nam mistakenly said, "Please take a shit," making everyone awkwardly look at each other, nearly blushing. Realizing his mistake, Nam quickly corrected himself by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, please sit down." It was a true mishap for someone learning to speak English and pronouncing words incorrectly, especially for older folks like Nam, whose tongue had already stiffened with age. So before speaking, one must twist their tongue and curl their lips many times to avoid making the same mistake Nam made when he first arrived. About a week later, Nam's family moved into an apartment nearby that the church had rented for them. The first month's rent had already been paid by the church, and the apartment was relatively comfortable, with 2 floors, 3 clean rooms upstairs, and a living room and dining room downstairs. There was a TV, enough furniture, dishes, and utensils to get by. Though everything was old, it was much appreciated. Now everything was relatively stable, and they could settle down. Nam began studying to take his driver's license test. Mr. Calling gave Nam more than an hour of driving lessons to get used to the controls and city streets. Eventually, Nam got his license, but he still didn't have enough money to buy a car. The day after they moved into the apartment, Mr. Anderson from the church took Nam for a job interview at Sunstrand, where they offered him a job as an electronic assembler. The company agreed to hire him temporarily at $2.32 an hour, but he had to work the night shift before he could be moved to the day shift. This was Nam's first job in a private company. Since leaving school, Nam had immediately joined the military, where everything from A to Z was taken care of by the government. He considered his unit as his family, and his daily work as household chores, so he had grown accustomed to the military lifestyle and discipline. Now working for a private company, Nam didn't know what to expect. So after the interview, whatever the company said, Nam accepted without hesitation, even the low wage. In reality, Nam didn't know how to negotiate or understand his rights. These were the disadvantages of not having someone experienced to advise him. For the church, it seemed that as soon as Nam got a job, it relieved them of a burden, so they never pointed out any potential benefits or drawbacks. Nam didn't mean to imply that they were bad people. Most of the church members who helped his family were kind and dedicated. But that was the nature of things. If it didn't involve their interests or beliefs, they wouldn't bother or get involved. Since it was the summer of 1975 and schools were on break, Nam's eldest son, Mickey, hadn't started school yet. The church ladies either taught him at home, or took him to learn English with his mother at Bellevue Community College. Each week, Nam's wife was taken to shop at American supermarkets to buy groceries for the week, with the church usually covering the cost. Nam's wife saved the food stamps to buy Asian groceries at Wasan in Seattle's Chinatown. Nam still didn't have a car, so for any trips beyond walking distance, he had to rely on others, which was quite frustrating. So he often stayed home watching TV to avoid bothering others. The TV only had 2 channels that worked, but you had to bang on the box several times to get the picture to stabilize so you could watch Gilligan's Island on Channel 11 and Mr. Rogers on Channel 9. The other channels were just black and white stripes. After 2 weeks, the picture was completely lost, and Nam had to ask Mr. Hanner to take it to the shop for repairs, costing $27. Even after the repair, the black and white picture wasn't much better than before. However, thanks to the TV, Nam's family gradually learned to understand a bit of English. Every morning, they would take turns picking up dust under the carpet because they didn't have a vacuum cleaner. Sometimes, when it got too dirty, Nam would go to the apartment office to borrow a vacuum. The house didn't have a single nail, hammer, or anything useful for repairs, which made it difficult when something needed fixing. It wasn't that they were too stingy to buy the necessary tools, but they didn't know where to buy them or which store to go to. Cars roared by on the street, but no one walked, so they couldn't just walk to the store. Nam worked the night shift, leaving around 2 in the afternoon with someone giving him a ride. He returned late at night with someone else picking him up. The strict schedule and reliance on others for transportation were extremely frustrating, but he endured it. Nam's job at the company was monotonous, just assembling small electronic parts. Most of the workers around him were women, with only the supervisor, George Buber, a Vietnam War veteran named Gary, who worked as a welder, and Nam as the only men. The work was repetitive, the same tasks day in and day out. A few weeks later, while distributing paychecks, the supervisor told Nam that he understood his situation and knew that the wages weren't enough to support a wife and 3 children. He introduced Nam to an electronics instructor at Lake Washington Vocational School to take night classes. He took Nam to meet Mr. Charles Ailing in the next room to discuss going to school. After their conversation, Mr. Ailing promised to help Nam with transportation to attend evening classes since Nam didn't have a car yet. The supervisor also promised to move Nam to the day shift so he could attend night school. The following week, Nam started working the day shift. For the first few days, he had to ride his bicycle to work because the church hadn't arranged for someone to give him a ride yet. The distance wasn't too far, about 10 kilometers, but the road had many hills, making the ride exhausting. Since there was no bus route, walking or biking was the only option. During this time, Nam befriended a man from the Montagnard tribe in Kontum, Vietnam, who had served in the Special Forces with the U.S. Army. His family had come over around the same time as Nam's. He got a job digging ditches and building roads nearby, but he didn't have money to buy a car, so he also had to bike to work like Nam. But his situation was a bit tougher because, early in the morning, he had to ride past several houses with dogs. The dogs would bark and chase him, biting his legs and pulling at his pants, so he had to pedal for his life. Every morning, he would tightly roll up his pants and pedal as fast as he could past those houses. In the evening, he did the same to avoid getting bitten by the dogs. Occasionally, he would complain that his sponsor wouldn't let him apply for Social Security benefits or food stamps, and forced him to work to support his family. He also didn't have the opportunity to go to school or learn any skills. Every evening after work, after dinner, Mr. Charles Ailing would pick Nam up around 7 to go to school, and he would bring him back home around 10 o'clock. He explained that studying in this field would lead to better pay and easier work, not as physically demanding as other jobs. A few times, he took Nam to his shop to show him all the electronic measuring devices. At the time, Nam was clueless and didn't understand anything, but he admired Mr. Ailing's knowledge in this field. A week later, Nam bought a car and began driving himself to school, no longer relying on Mr. Ailing for rides or the church members for transportation. Nam saved up about $700 from his job and Social Security. Nam told Mr. Hanner that he wanted to buy a car for transportation and asked him to help find a used car in the church. About a week later, Mr. Hanner called Nam to tell him about a used 1965 red Plymouth Valiant with a good engine. The owner was asking $650. After a test drive, Nam agreed to buy it. When signing the title transfer, Mr. Hanner said the church would cover $250, and Nam would have to pay the remaining $400. Once everything was finalized, Nam drove the car home to show his wife and children, and everyone was overjoyed. Nam's wife, besides attending English classes at BCC, also had church members teaching her conversational skills, so her English improved a bit. She could greet and ask simple questions, no longer just smiling or using hand gestures. The church members came to visit often, and Nam didn't know all their names. His adopted niece came up with a way to rename them with Vietnamese names that were easier to remember, such as Mr. and Mrs. Lan Chow, Mr. and Mrs. Y. Dick, and Mr. and Mrs. Backman. It worked because whenever someone mentioned these names, they immediately knew who was being referred to. Because there were so many people coming and going, helping and visiting, Nam's wife assumed that every American who visited was a church member. One day, the neighbor next door, noticing that Nam's wife didn't have a car, offered to take her shopping. Nam's wife assumed it was a church member, as usual, taking her to buy groceries for the week. The kind neighbor even pointed out what was good, what was on sale, and what could be stored for a long time. Nam's wife filled the cart, and when they reached the checkout, the total came to nearly $40. The cashier spoke a string of English words, but Nam's wife stood there, staring blankly, not understanding a word. The neighbor, feeling awkward, pulled out her wallet and paid for everything. That evening, when Nam came home from work, the neighbor told him what had happened. Nam explained that his wife had mistaken her for a church member, which made the neighbor laugh heartily. She apologized for the misunderstanding and offered to let Nam's wife keep the groceries, but Nam insisted on paying her back in full. During the early days of settling in, Nam's wife had to endure many sudden changes, from the external material conditions to the internal emotional strain. The language barrier and the completely different social environment often left her looking more sad than happy. Nam's younger sister, who was a nurse and had worked at the Christian hospital in Saigon, had come to the U.S. with the hospital delegation, working in a small town in California. She occasionally called to talk to Nam's wife, and the two sisters would lament feeling homesick and end up crying together on the phone for hours. Nam's children were initially shy and hesitant around the local children, but soon they blended in easily, as if they had known each other for a long time. They spoke Vietnamese mixed with a few English words they had just learned, but somehow the American kids seemed to understand. One day, Nam called his second son, Mika, to come in for dinner while he was playing with the neighborhood kids. Nam listened as Mika told his American friends, "My daddy called me D and calm. My daddy called me in to eat dinner." The American kids understood immediately and nodded okay. As for Nam, since setting foot here, he had only stayed home for about a week before starting work, so he didn't have much free time to think or ponder. During the day he worked, and at night he studied his trade. Any spare time was spent reviewing his lessons because his English proficiency was limited, so he had to read and reread the technical terms in his textbooks multiple times to fully understand them, which took up a lot of time. When Nam received his first paycheck, the Social Security benefits were immediately cut in half, so he had to save carefully just to cover the rent and car insurance for the following month. In reality, everyone likes free money, but Nam was fed up with the social services constantly calling him in for interviews and paperwork, making it difficult for him in various ways. Even when he had a bit of extra money, he didn't dare deposit it in the bank because anything over $500 required additional paperwork. When using food stamps to buy groceries, the people around him would stare, looking down on him. Nam's wife felt extremely uncomfortable. Poor her, she bore the brunt of these bitter experiences. Whenever they used food stamps, Nam would sneak out to the car, leaving her to handle the payment. When it came to medical or dental care, They had to ask around to find doctors who accepted medical coupons, which were usually taken by doctors who had few patients or were new to the field, reluctantly accepting them for treatment because Nam's job was temporary, and the company didn't offer insurance for his family like it did for long-term employees. A few weeks later, school resumed after the summer break. The oldest child started attending Hilaire Elementary School nearby, taking the school bus, which conveniently stopped right in front of the apartment, so there wasn't much to worry about. The second child, Mika, was taken to kindergarten daily by church members, leaving only the youngest daughter, Mina, at home with her mother. Daily life settled into a routine. Initially, Nam only remembered appointments without writing them down, but within a few weeks, there were too many things to remember, so he had to keep a schedule like a timetable, checking it daily to see if there were any appointments or tasks to complete. Life began to feel mechanical, with set times for waking up and sleeping, unlike back home, where the days were more flexible. Only the weekends remained free, allowing them to do as they pleased. Nearly 6 months passed, and Nam became acquainted with a few Vietnamese families living in nearby apartments, where the rent was relatively cheaper. Nam decided to move to a new place. The church members helped Nam's family with the move. The new location was closer to the market and school, reducing the need to rely on others. Work at the company began to slow down. For the past few weeks, Nam noticed that every Friday someone would leave with their toolbox looking sad. Upon inquiry, he learned that the company was laying people off. About 2 weeks later, the supervisor called Nam and asked to speak with him privately upstairs in the cafeteria where employees had lunch. After sitting down, the supervisor looked at Nam with a sad expression and quietly informed him that unfortunately, the company couldn't keep him any longer due to the current situation. He handed Nam a thick stack of papers with the names, phone numbers, and addresses of other companies to apply to, along with a letter of recommendation praising Nam's work. He also encouraged Nam to continue his studies in the trade and assured him that if the company's situation improved, he would be called back if he was still interested. That evening, Nam came home earlier than usual, carrying his toolbox. His wife was surprised and asked, "Oh, why are you home so early today?" Nam set the toolbox aside and slowly sat down. "I got laid off today because there's no more work." His wife picked up the toolbox to put it away and calmly said, "Well, take a few days off, then slowly start looking for another job." Nam sat quietly, staring out the window. Normally, Friday evenings were a time to be happy, but today was different. He didn't feel like cleaning or preparing the car for a Saturday or Sunday outing, as he usually did since buying the car. This was the first time in his life that he had been laid off, so he wasn't sure if it was because he wasn't doing a good job or if the company simply didn't have enough work. At that moment, Nam felt that being laid off was something shameful, but in reality it was quite normal in advanced societies like America or Europe. Being laid off can sometimes be a lucky opportunity because once people have a job, they often don't bother looking for better or higher paying opportunities elsewhere. That evening, Nam called Mr. Anderson, the church representative in charge of his job, thinking that he was someone with a lot of influence and connections with many companies in the area, so finding a low-wage job like Nam's should be relatively easy for him to arrange. After the dull weekend days passed, on the following Monday evening, Nam received a phone call from him, informing him that there was someone interested in interviewing him for a job. After getting the name, address, and time for the interview, he told Nam that the job would be as a custodian at a school in the Bellevue district. Upon hearing this, Nam had no idea what kind of job it was. This was a completely new term for him, given his limited English at the time, and there was no dictionary at home to check what it meant. Nam discussed with his wife, saying, "I'm so small, how can I do a custodian job?" His wife didn't know any better either, but she encouraged him, saying, "Just go to the interview and see how it goes." The entire night, Nam was restless and couldn't sleep, constantly thinking about the custodian job. He remembered back in the days when he was a student at Southang School, Sometimes in the afternoons, he would visit the Phan Dinh Phung Stadium to practice sports. During that time, there was a famous bodybuilder named Kosto Nguyen who was an idol among the youth. Occasionally, he would perform to promote physical fitness among the young students. Nam kept thinking that they had mistakenly called the wrong person, but he comforted himself, thinking, "Never mind, just go to the interview and see what happens, there's nothing to lose." 2 weeks later, Nam picked out the best outfit from his old clothes, polished his shoes to a shine, combed his hair neatly, and drove to the meeting point 10 minutes early. After greeting the receptionist, Nam sat and waited for about 5 minutes before a man in his 50s, wearing a proper vest and tie, came out, shook hands with him, and then guided him to his car to drive together to a nearby school, saying it was to introduce Nam to the night shift team leader there. Although a bit surprised, Nam remained silent to see what would happen. Not long after, the car stopped in front of the school's flagpole. The man led Nam around to the back of the school, and as they entered the basketball court, they met the elderly night shift leader who was struggling to push a huge trash bin outside. After asking a few cursory questions, the man introduced Nam to the night shift leader and told him to show Nam the tasks he would be doing. Meanwhile, he himself had some business to attend to in the principal's office and would return in half an hour to take Nam back. Nam felt like he was in a dream, moving from one surprise to another. Yet by then, he had started to get a clearer picture of what was happening, though still not entirely. The elderly team leader was a black man who seemed to have uneven legs, making his gait slightly unsteady. His face and dark complexion made it hard for Nam to see the wrinkles on his forehead, so he couldn't guess his age. However, based on his appearance, Nam estimated that he must have been over 50. With a husky voice, like someone with a drinking habit, he didn't bother with pleasantries or asking Nam's name and age. He simply gestured for Nam to follow him, leading him to each classroom, showing him how to sweep the desks, mop the floors, wipe the boards, take out the trash, etc. Now, Nam fully understood what a custodian job was. To this day, whenever he recalls the word custodian, Nam can't help but laugh at his own ignorance of the language. He thought the Americans were playing with words. What we would call a school janitor back home they refer to with more civilized terms like building engineer, building maintenance, housekeeper, etc. After returning to the management office of the Bellevue district, the supervisor asked Nam about his work experience. After Nam explained his military background and mentioned that he was a very clean person who always kept his house meticulously tidy, the supervisor nodded in agreement. Finally, the supervisor told Nam that they agreed to hire him on a temporary basis, work on call, and that he would be paid $4.32 per hour. In truth, when Nam was shown the job duties, he felt very discouraged. However, when he heard the relatively good wage, he felt somewhat more relieved. After all, in just a short time, less than a week, he had suddenly received a pay raise from $2.32 an hour to $4.32 an hour, much more than he had expected. When he was working at Sunstrand, he had dreamed of getting a job like Gary's, where he earned $3 an hour as a welder. But now, although the job was different, Nam would be earning much more than that, so he immediately accepted the offer. On the way home, Nam's thoughts were mixed between the work he would be doing and the attractive wage. However, it seemed he hadn't had enough time to erase the memories, the past that was still lurking within him. Nam wanted to forget and bury it in some corner of his life, but sometimes it would spring back like an uncontrollable spring, causing storms to rise in his mind for a few brief moments. Today was Nam's first day as a school janitor. After instructing his wife to pack some rice and a few dishes in a lunchbox for dinner, he carefully chose an old set of clothes to wear and put on a black cap. Standing in front of the mirror, Nam felt like he could blend in with the elderly black team leader who had shown him the job during the interview the previous week. Nam's wife handed him the food box as he got into the car. Glancing at her face and the half-smile, Nam suddenly remembered a song from before, dedicated to a heroic Red Beret soldier named Duong, who had gloriously sacrificed himself for the country. "You won't die, my love. You'll come back?" It was similar to when Nam had gone on distant military assignments, and his wife would worry about all sorts of things, reminding him of every little detail as she handed him his bag and saw him off to the car. Nam felt like a soldier going off to war, just as in the verses of Chin Fu Gam. With a black flight suit, a gun at his side, and a black cap adorned with 2 white willow branches proudly on its brim. Now dressed in black with a black cap, but in 2 completely different circumstances, instead of sitting in a cockpit soaring through the skies to the battlefield, Nam clutched a large feather duster, standing under the school's roof, sweeping back and forth on the wooden floor as if trying to erase the traces of his past. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Nam got out of the car and walked to the back of the school to report to the elderly night shift team leader for work instructions. Since it was the first day and he wasn't yet familiar with the tasks, Nam just followed the leader to help push desks, arrange necessary items in the gym, and collect trash from the bins in the classrooms. Whatever the leader asked him to do, Nam did without adding or questioning anything. In those early days, he felt like a girl who had missed her chance and accepted a marriage out of desperation without truly loving or valuing it. He hadn't fully accepted or integrated into the work he was doing. Nam often avoided places where parents or teachers frequently gathered, perhaps because of his deep sense of discouragement from the sudden change in his life, leading to thoughts filled with self-pity and inferiority. In fact, Nam wasn't overreacting to the situation, but he did feel a sense of inferiority at that time. He might have been one of the first Vietnamese people to work as a school janitor, while most of the Vietnamese people he knew had jobs as teaching assistants, social workers, store clerks, or warehouse workers. They might have been paid less, but their jobs were more respectable. Meanwhile, the people around Nam who did similar jobs were mostly elderly, with gloomy, worn-out faces, dressed in dirty, smelly clothes that were very unpleasant. Nam thought that if there had been a few more Vietnamese people working with him, he might have felt less embarrassed and would likely have had a different outlook on the situation. Because it was a temporary job, Nam didn't work at any particular school consistently. He would move around wherever they needed extra help, or he would stay home if there was no need for additional staff that day. On average, he worked 3 nights a week. During this time, Nam became close friends with Mr. Lai Nguyen, and Mr. Lai Nguyen. Mr. X was working as a teaching assistant, while Mr. S was working at the Pay and Save store. Nam still remembers that Mr. X was the first person to own a color television, a 25-inch set he had just bought to watch the 1976 Olympic Games. Every Saturday evening, Nam's family would go to his house in Kirkland, where they would cook, drink, and watch TV until late at night. Sometimes they would drive up to Marysville to catch crabs. In those early years, the sea crabs were abundant. All they had to do was buy chicken wings and necks, put them in a trap, lower it into the water, and after 5 minutes, dozens of large crabs would be caught, each one about the length of a hand. They would bring the crabs back, fill the bathtub to wash them, then boil or salt them for a feast with red wine. One day, Nam discussed with Mr. X about learning a new trade to change careers. Mr. X was very enthusiastic and agreed immediately. He said that they should learn something practical and short-term so that they could earn money to support their families. Nam told him that he had been studying electronics for more than 6 months at a vocational school in Kirkland, but it wasn't going well. He wanted to apply to a professional school to become a fully qualified electronics technician. After a short time following the programs at the community colleges, Nam wasn't very satisfied because it took too long and included too many unnecessary subjects. During a visit to friends in Tacoma, Nam met Mr. Hong Thien V, another former Air Force officer. Mr. V told him about a well-known private technical school in Seattle that specialized in this field. It had experienced instructors, modern laboratories, and well-equipped training facilities. However, the tuition was quite expensive, about $400 a month. But when students graduated, they would surely have the knowledge and practical experience to find a job. Not wanting to miss this opportunity, a few days later, Nam and Mr. X went to check out the school and learn more about the vocational program. After being shown around by a school representative and observing students practicing in the labs, Nam felt that this was exactly what he had been looking for. The representative also mentioned that the school would guide and assist with financial aid applications for students in need. About a week later, Nam and Mr. X were called in to take a math test and other related subjects to assess their analytical skills in electronics. The test wasn't too difficult, and both Nam and Mr. X passed and were accepted into the program. We hope you enjoyed the excerpt from this chapter. The complete audiobook of The Last Flight Out by Nguyen Van Ba can be purchased on platforms like Google Play and others. Please subscribe to this channel for more content like this.